They called it Miller's Point because 3 generations of Millers had died trying to take it. The rocky outcrop dominated the valley like a stone fortress, its sheer faces offering perfect fields of fire in every direction. Today, it bristled with enemy positions, machine gun nests carved into granite, sniper hides that commanded everything below. The Taliban had turned it into an impregnable fortress, and Alpha Company was about to walk into their kill zone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Hayes studied the terrain through his field glasses, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on his face despite the Praeton chill. 15 years of combat had taught him to read ground like scripture, and this particular verse promised nothing but bad news. The enemy held every advantage: elevation, concealment, prepared positions, and the luxury of time to zero their weapons on predetermined targets. "Sir, we've got movement on the north face," reported Sergeant Collins, his voice tight with the controlled tension that preceded contact. "At least 6 positions I can count, probably more we can't see." Hayes nodded grimly. Intelligence had promised the ridge would be lightly defended. Intelligence had been wrong before, usually at the worst possible moments. Now his company was committed to an assault that looked increasingly like a suicide mission. The valley floor stretched ahead like an amphitheater designed for slaughter. Open ground, scattered boulders that wouldn't stop rifle rounds, and a gentle slope that would slow their advance while providing perfect target practice for the defenders above. Hayes had seen this movie before, and it never ended well for the guys in American uniforms. Behind him, Alpha Company prepared for what everyone knew was going to be a bloodbath. These weren't green recruits fresh from basic training. They were seasoned veterans of multiple deployments, men who had survived Fallujah, Ramadi, and a dozen other places where good soldiers went to die. They knew the mathematics of warfare, understood that attacking uphill against prepared positions was how you turned living soldiers into names on monuments back home. Staff. Sergeant Coleman checked his rifle for the 100th time, a nervous habit that had kept him alive through 4 combat tours. "Captain, this is going to be a meat grinder. We need artillery prep, close air support, something to soften those positions before we go up that slope." Hayes shared the sentiment, but the mission parameters were inflexible. No artillery available, air support committed elsewhere, and a timeline that wouldn't wait for optimal conditions. Sometimes war demanded impossible things from good people, and today was one of those days. "We go in 30 minutes, Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the staging area with the authority of command. "Hard and fast, use the boulders for cover where you can find it, but don't stop moving. The longer we stay in that kill zone, the more of us don't come home." The soldiers of Alpha Company absorbed this information with the stoic resignation of professionals. They understood the tactical situation, recognized the odds, and would follow orders anyway because that's what soldiers did. Fear was present, but controlled, channeled into the kind of focused aggression that turned ordinary men into efficient killers when circumstances demanded it. Private Morrison, the youngest member of the company at 19, fidgeted with his gear while trying to project confidence he didn't feel. This was his first major engagement, and the veteran's grim expressions told him everything he needed to know about their chances. The movies never showed this part, the waiting, the thinking, the slow realization that you might be about to die in a place whose name you couldn't pronounce for reasons you didn't entirely understand. "Easy, kid," Corporal Thompson muttered, noticing Morrison's nervousness. "Just stick close, follow orders, and remember your training. Most dying is just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Try to be in the right place." The horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn, which meant their window of darkness was closing rapidly. Night vision equipment gave them advantages the enemy lacked, but those advantages evaporated with the sunrise. Soon they would be exposed, visible, vulnerable to every rifle and machine gun on Miller's Point. Hayes studied his map one final time, searching for alternatives that didn't exist. The ground was what it was, the enemy positions were where they were, and the mission remained unchanged regardless of tactical realities. Sometimes leadership meant accepting responsibility for decisions made by people who would never face their consequences. That's when he noticed her. Specialist Kennedy had positioned herself apart from the main group, not in the way of someone avoiding responsibility, but with the focused isolation of someone making complex calculations. She was studying the ridge through her own optics, but her attention wasn't focused on Miller's Point where the enemy waited. Instead, she was examining the secondary ridgeline to the east, a lower formation that everyone else had dismissed as tactically irrelevant. Hayes had noticed Kennedy before, though not for the reasons that typically drew attention to female soldiers. In infantry units, she was competent, quiet, and possessed the kind of steady professionalism that made good soldiers regardless of gender. Her marksmanship scores were exceptional, but so were several others in the company. What set her apart was something harder to quantify, a way of seeing terrain and angles that suggested an intuitive understanding of ballistics and geometry. "What are you looking at, Kennedy?" Hayes asked, moving to her position. She lowered her rifle scope and pointed toward the eastern ridge. "That formation, sir. Everyone's focused on Miller's Point, but there's a shooting position on Ridge 47 that nobody's considered." Hayes followed her gesture to the distant ridgeline. It was lower than Miller's Point, further away, and appeared to offer no tactical value whatsoever. "That ridge is too far out, Kennedy. Even if you could get there without being spotted, the range would be extreme for effective fire." "Yes, sir," she replied, but her tone suggested polite disagreement rather than acceptance. "It would be a challenging shot, but the angle of attack would be completely unexpected. Everyone up there is oriented toward the valley floor, prepared for a frontal assault. They wouldn't be watching their six." Hayes considered this. Kennedy was right about the enemy's likely orientation, but the logistics of reaching that distant ridge while the rest of the company launched their assault seemed impossible. The timing would have to be perfect, and you'd be operating completely alone. No support, no backup, no way to coordinate with the main attack. Sometimes the best support is the support nobody sees coming, Kennedy said quietly. Before Hayes could respond, the radio crackled with the inevitable message from higher command. "Alpha 6, this is base. You are cleared hot for assault on Miller's Point. Execute immediately." Hayes keyed his microphone with resignation. "Roger, base. Alpha Company moving to contact." As the soldiers of Alpha Company began their final preparations for an assault that promised to be costly and possibly futile, Kennedy continued studying the distant eastern ridge through her scope. She saw possibilities where others saw only empty ground, understood angles that weren't obvious to conventional tactical thinking. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed prophetic given what was about to unfold. In 30 minutes, good soldiers would begin dying, because geography and enemy positions made survival a matter of luck rather than skill. Unless someone could change the fundamental mathematics of the battlefield. Hayes gave the signal, and Alpha Company began moving toward their appointment with Miller's Point. Behind them, Kennedy made a decision that would either save lives or add her name to the casualty list. She began moving toward the eastern ridge, carrying possibilities that nobody else had considered and skills that nobody else fully understood. Kennedy's request came at the worst possible moment. Captain Hayes was coordinating final radio checks when she approached, her rifle slung and map case in hand. The company was minutes from stepping off, nerves stretched tight as piano wire. And here was a specialist suggesting tactical modifications to a plan that had been locked in stone by higher command. "Sir, request permission to establish an overwatch position on Ridge 47, Kennedy said. her voice steady despite the chaos of final preparations around them. Hayes barely looked up from his radio. "Negative, Kennedy. I need every rifle in the assault element. We're already undermanned for what they're asking us to do." "Captain, with respect, one more rifle in the assault won't change the mathematics. But a flanking position could alter the entire tactical picture." She unfolded her map, pointing to elevation markers and grid coordinates. Ridge 47 provides clear sightlines to their reverse slope positions. They'll never see it coming. Staff Sergeant Coleman overheard and inserted himself into the conversation with the protective instincts of a veteran NCO. "Kennedy, this isn't the time for creative thinking. The plan is the plan. We go up the middle, fast and hard, and hope our momentum carries us through their kill zone." Kennedy's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained military bearing. "Sergeant, momentum won't stop machine gun fire, but a well-placed shot eliminating their overwatch positions could save half the company." "Well-placed shot?" Coleman's tone carried the dismissive edge of someone who'd heard big talk from young soldiers before. "You're talking about extreme range shooting under combat conditions. This isn't a range qualification, specialist. This is life and death." Hayes finally gave Kennedy his full attention, studying her expression for signs of overconfidence or naive heroism. What he saw instead was the calm calculation of someone who had already run the numbers and reached a conclusion. "What kind of range are we talking about, Kennedy?" "Approximately 1,200 meters to their primary machine gun position, sir. Challenging but manageable with proper wind calculation and target identification." Colonel Peterson's voice crackled through the radio before Hayes could respond. "Alpha 6, what's your status? We need you moving in 5 minutes. The other elements are already in position." Hayes keyed his microphone. "Roger, base. Final coordination complete. Moving to the line of departure." As he signed off, Coleman shook his head emphatically. "Captain, she's talking about a shot that most snipers wouldn't attempt with optimal conditions. This is combat, not a shooting competition. Variables change by the second, and there's no second chances if she misses." "I won't miss, Kennedy," said quietly, the words carrying absolute conviction. "That's what they all say," Coleman replied, his tone softening slightly. "Look, Kennedy, I've seen good soldiers die because they thought they were better than the laws of physics. Pride kills just as effectively as enemy bullets. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Around them, Alpha Company was conducting final equipment checks with the methodical efficiency of professionals. Weapons were chambered, gear secured, and last letters home sealed in cargo pockets. The familiar pre-combat ritual that transformed civilians in uniform back into warriors. Private Morrison approached Kennedy during a brief lull in the discussion. "Specialist Kennedy, is it true you qualified expert on every weapon system in BASIC?" "Marksmanship is just mathematics, Morrison. Consistent fundamentals applied under varying conditions." Kennedy's response was matter-of-fact, devoid of boasting. "The rifle doesn't care about your gender, your background, or your confidence level. It responds to proper technique and sound calculations." Corporal Thompson laughed, not mockingly, but with the skepticism of experience. "Mathematics don't account for adrenaline, Kennedy. When bullets start flying and your heart rate hits 180, all that marksmanship theory goes out the window. Combat shooting is a different animal entirely." Kennedy considered this seriously before responding. "You're right about the physiological factors, Corporal. But that's why training exists, to make proper technique automatic regardless of stress conditions. The fundamentals don't change just because people are shooting back." Hayes found himself caught between competing pressures. His orders were clear: assault Miller's Point with maximum force and speed. But Kennedy's proposal offered something rare in modern warfare: a genuine tactical advantage that could shift the odds in their favor. The problem was the risk involved. In fragmenting his force for what amounted to a single soldier's theory about battlefield geometry. Kennedy, even if I approve this, how do you plan to reach that ridge without being spotted? The approach is completely exposed for the last 400 meters. The enemy's attention will be focused on the valley floor once the assault begins, sir. They'll be tracking your movement, adjusting fire, coordinating their defensive response. A single soldier moving perpendicular to their primary concern becomes effectively invisible. Staff Sergeant Coleman crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. That's a lot of assumptions about enemy behavior, specialist. What happens if they have security posted on that ridge? What happens if they spot you during your approach? You'd be isolated, outnumbered, and too far away for support. Then I adapt and overcome, Sergeant. Same as any other mission parameter. The radio demanded Hayes' attention again. Alpha 6, you are holding up the timeline. Execute immediately or provide status update. Hayes felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the knowledge that his choices would determine who went home and who became statistics. Kennedy's plan had merit, but it also had variables that could spiral rapidly beyond control. Traditional military doctrine favored concentrated force over dispersed operations, especially in terrain that favored defenders. Captain Kennedy sighed, sensing his hesitation. Every minute we delay increases the enemy's readiness. They know we're coming. They're using this time to improve their positions, coordinate their fields of fire, and prepare for our assault. A flanking shot becomes more difficult as they become more alert to threats. Morrison spoke up again, his young voice carrying genuine curiosity. Specialist Kennedy, what's the longest shot you've ever made? Kennedy paused, considering how much to reveal. Range conditions or combat conditions? Combat, Thompson interjected, now genuinely interested despite his skepticism. Classified. Kennedy replied simply, but her tone suggested experiences that went beyond basic military training. Hayes made his decision with the finality that command required. Negative, Kennedy. I can't spare personnel for experimental tactics. You stay with the assault element. We need every rifle moving up that slope. Kennedy accepted the decision. With military bearing, but Hayes caught a flash of something in her expression, not disappointment, but the kind of professional frustration that came from seeing tactical opportunities slip away due to conventional thinking. As Alpha Company began their movement toward Miller's Point, Kennedy took her position in the assault formation. But her eyes kept drifting toward the eastern ridge, seeing angles and possibilities that others dismissed as irrelevant. Sometimes, the best solutions were the ones that nobody expected, the shots that came from positions that common sense said were impossible. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the likelihood that good soldiers would die today because geography favored the enemy. Unless someone was willing to change the rules of engagement in ways that conventional tactics never considered. The first rounds came in hot and low, cracking over Alpha Company's heads with the distinctive snap that meant someone up on Miller's Point had excellent marksmanship skills. Hayes hit the dirt behind a boulder that wasn't nearly large enough, his radio operator scrambling to maintain communications, while incoming fire turned their careful assault plan into controlled chaos. Contact front, contact front. Sergeant Coleman's voice cut through the gunfire. Machine gun position, north face, grid 294 to 847. Kennedy had dropped prone behind a rock formation 30 meters to Hayes' left, her rifle already tracking potential targets through her scope. But instead of engaging the obvious threats like the rest of the company, she was studying the enemy's positioning patterns, noting firing angles and dead spaces that weren't visible to soldiers focused on immediate survival. The Taliban fighters on Miller's Point had arranged their defense with professional competence. Overlapping fields of fire, mutually supporting positions, and excellent use of natural cover. But they had made one critical assumption, that any threat would come from the valley floor below. Their entire defensive scheme was oriented toward that single direction. "Hayes, we need to break contact and call for artillery," Coleman shouted over the incoming rounds. "This is exactly what I predicted. We're sitting ducks down here." But artillery support was still hours away, and breaking contact meant abandoning the mission that higher command had deemed essential. Hayes watched his options evaporate as enemy fire intensified, pinning his company in positions that offered minimal cover and no tactical advantage. That's when Kennedy moved, not backward toward safety, but laterally across the slope, using terrain features that others hadn't noticed. Her movement was precise, controlled, never exposing herself unnecessarily, but covering ground with efficiency that spoke of advanced tactical training. Several soldiers noticed her displacement, but assumed she was repositioning for better cover. Hayes caught sight of her movement through his peripheral vision. "Kennedy, get back in position. We need concentrated fire on their machine gun nests." Kennedy's response came through her radio headset, calm despite the chaos around them. "Sir, recommend shifting fire to suppress their observation posts. Primary targets are calling adjustments to supporting positions." Hayes followed her logic and realized she was right. The enemy's most effective fire was coming from positions that weren't visible to most of his company. Someone up there was directing the engagement with tactical skill that suggested formal military training rather than guerrilla experience. "How can you tell?" Hayes asked, genuinely curious despite the tactical situation. "Watch the timing of their fire adjustments, sir. Too coordinated for independent action. They have a spotter calling corrections." Kennedy's voice remained steady as she continued her lateral movement. "If I can reach that outcropping at grid 298 to 853, I should have clear sight lines to their command element." Coleman overheard the transmission and keyed his own radio. "Kennedy, that position is 200 meters from our current location. You'll be completely isolated and well outside our support range." "Roger, Sergeant." "But also outside their primary observation area." What happened next changed everything. Kennedy reached the outcropping. She'd identified and immediately began engaging targets that the rest of Alpha Company couldn't even see. Her first shot eliminated an enemy spotter who had been directing fire adjustments from a concealed position. The coordinated enemy fire immediately became less accurate. Her second shot silenced a machine gun position that had been enfilading the company's right flank. Hayes watched through his binoculars as the enemy gunner simply disappeared behind his weapon, the gun falling silent. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Morrison, who had been watching Kennedy shooting through his own optics. "She just made 2 consecutive hits at what, 800 meters? Under combat conditions?" Thompson was equally impressed despite his earlier skepticism. "Those weren't lucky shots. Watch her rhythm, her breathing control. She's shooting like this is a training exercise." Kennedy's third shot was the one that made believers out of skeptics. An enemy sniper had been engaging Alpha Company from a well-concealed hide that most soldiers couldn't even locate. Kennedy not only found him but eliminated him with a single round that traveled nearly 900 meters through shifting mountain air. "Kennedy, what's your ammunition status?" Hayes asked, beginning to understand that his specialist might possess capabilities that went far beyond standard military training. "Sufficient for mission completion, sir. But I'm observing additional targets that require prosecution from a more advantageous angle." Hayes processed this information while incoming fire continued to pin down most of his company. Kennedy had single-handedly neutralized 3 enemy positions that had been causing the most problems, but dozens of Taliban fighters remained in prepared positions throughout Miller's Point. "What kind of advantageous angle are you talking about? Specialist?" Kennedy's pause before responding suggested she was weighing her words carefully. "Sir, Ridge 47 is still viable. From this position, I can see approach routes that weren't visible from our original staging area. The eastern face has dead space that would allow undetected movement. Staff Sergeant Coleman's voice cut in with frustrated disbelief. Kennedy, you're talking about leaving the company entirely to pursue a flanking maneuver that may or may not work. This isn't Call of Duty. This is real combat with real consequences. Sergeant, with respect, real combat is exactly why unconventional approaches become necessary. Traditional tactics are failing because the enemy holds every conventional advantage. Hayes found himself facing the same decision he'd rejected 20 minutes earlier, but with new information. Kennedy had just demonstrated shooting capabilities that exceeded anything in her official records. Her tactical analysis had proven accurate under fire, and her proposed solution was beginning to look less like desperation and more like tactical innovation. Private Morrison's voice came over the radio with nervous excitement. Sir, whatever Specialist Kennedy is doing, it's working. Enemy fire has decreased by at least 50% since she started engaging. But the enemy wasn't passive. Taliban fighters were beginning to adjust their positions, searching for the source of accurate fire that was eliminating their key personnel. Soon they would locate Kennedy's position and bring overwhelming firepower to bear on her isolated location. Kennedy, you need to be displaced immediately, Has ordered. They're going to triangulate your position and hit you with everything. They have. Roger, sir. Moving to a secondary position. What she didn't say was that her secondary position was the first waypoint on the route to Ridge 47. Kennedy had already identified the approach, calculated the timeline, and determined that conventional tactics would result in unacceptable casualties. For Alpha Company Dot, as enemy fire began concentrating on her previous position, Kennedy disappeared into terrain that seemed too exposed for concealment. But she moved with confidence that suggested intimate familiarity with advanced fieldcraft techniques, using microterrain and natural camouflage in ways that made her effectively invisible to observers on Miller's Point. Hayes watched her vanish and realized that his specialist had just demonstrated capabilities that belonged in special operations units, not regular infantry companies. The question was whether those capabilities were sufficient for what she was apparently planning to attempt. Coleman, maintain suppressive fire on the north face positions, Hayes ordered. Kennedy, report your status every 10 minutes. And Kennedy? Yes, sir. Don't do anything stupid out there. Kennedy's response carried a confidence that was both reassuring and slightly unsettling. Sir, stupid is continuing frontal assaults against prepared positions when tactical alternatives exist. I'll be in position within 30 minutes. As she disappeared completely from view, Alpha Company continued their engagement with an enemy that still held overwhelming advantages. But for the first time since the shooting started, Hayes began to believe that tactical surprise might be possible after all. Kennedy's approach to Ridge 47 required 47 minutes of movement that would have been impossible for most soldiers. The terrain demanded intimate knowledge of camouflage and concealment, patience to move slowly when every instinct screamed for speed, and the physical conditioning to maintain precision while carrying full combat load across broken ground. She used every micro-terrain feature available: shallow depressions that provided concealment from observation, rock formations that broke up her silhouette, and natural vegetation that masked her movement from enemy positions. Her ghillie suit components, carefully integrated into standard military gear, transformed her from a recognizable human form into something that blended seamlessly with the Afghan landscape. The Taliban fighters on Miller's Point remained focused on Alpha Company's positions in the valley below. Their disciplined fire continued to pin down Hayes' soldiers, but Kennedy's earlier eliminations had disrupted their coordination. Enemy commanders were repositioning personnel to replace casualties, creating gaps in their observation coverage that she exploited with professional precision. Radio communications crackled in her earpiece as Alpha Company fought to maintain contact without taking prohibitive casualties. Hayes' voice carried the strain of command decisions made under fire, while Coleman coordinated suppressive fire against targets that kept shifting positions along the mountainous ridgeline. "Kennedy, report status," Hayes transmitted during a brief lull in incoming fire. "Alpha 6, moving to final position. Estimate 15 minutes to optimal shooting location." Kennedy's voice remained steady despite the physical demands of her movement. Each word was measured, conserving breath for the climb ahead. Below her, the tactical situation continued deteriorating. Enemy reinforcements had arrived from positions further along the ridge system, bringing additional machine guns and RPG teams into the engagement. Alpha Company's ammunition consumption was becoming critical, and medical evacuation for wounded soldiers was impossible while under effective enemy fire. "Private," Morrison's voice cut through radio chatter with urgent concern. "Contact left, contact." "Left? They're trying to flank our position from the western approach." Kennedy paused her movement to observe the developing situation through her rifle scope. Enemy fighters were indeed attempting to outflank Alpha Company, using the same terrain features for concealment that she had employed during her own movement. Their tactical competence suggested formal military training rather than guerrilla experience. "Alpha 6, be advised enemy flanking movement from your western approach. Approximately 12 personnel with automatic weapons," Kennedy transmitted, providing overwatch intelligence from her elevated position. Hayes acknowledged her report while directing Corporal Thompson's squad to counter the flanking attempt. The engagement was expanding beyond the original assault plan, becoming the kind of complex, multi-directional firefight that consumed ammunition rapidly and produced casualties exponentially. Kennedy resumed her climb toward Ridge 47, knowing that every minute of delay increased the likelihood of Alpha Company taking casualties they couldn't afford. The ridge itself presented technical climbing challenges that required both physical strength and mental focus while maintaining awareness of potential enemy observation. The final approach to her chosen shooting position demanded 20 minutes of movement that tested every aspect of her fieldcraft training. The terrain was exposed to observation from multiple enemy positions, requiring her to time her movement with the rhythm of ongoing firefights when enemy attention was focused elsewhere. Reach the shooting position as the sun achieved optimal angle for long-range precision work. The location provided clear sightlines to Miller's point while remaining invisible to enemy positions due to its unexpected approach angle. Kennedy had calculated correctly. The Taliban fighters had oriented their entire defensive scheme toward threats from the valley floor. Creating a blind spot that she could exploit. Her shooting position required careful preparation. The rifle had to be stabilized on uneven ground using techniques that maximized accuracy while maintaining concealment. Her range-finding equipment provided precise distance measurements to multiple targets, while her weather instruments gathered atmospheric data essential for long-range ballistics calculations. "Alpha 6, I have visuals on primary targets. Request permission to engage," Kennedy transmitted, settling into her final shooting position with methodical precision. Hayes' response carried the weight of tactical desperation. Alpha Company was running low on ammunition, had taken 3 casualties, and faced enemy reinforcements that threatened to overwhelm their defensive positions. "Kennedy, you are hot. Take whatever shots you can make." What Kennedy saw through her rifle scope changed everything about the tactical situation. Miller's point wasn't just defended by Taliban fighters using individual initiative. The enemy had established a sophisticated command and control structure with designated leaders coordinating defensive fires from concealed positions that were invisible to Alpha Company. The primary target was an enemy commander positioned in a natural rock formation that provided excellent protection from frontal assault, but was completely exposed to her flanking angle. He was directing defensive fires through hand signals and radio communications, making him the key to disrupting enemy coordination. Asterisk secondary targets included machine gun teams whose positions dominated Alpha Company's approach routes. These weapons were emplaced in prepared positions with excellent fields of fire, but their crews had positioned themselves for optimal engagement of valley floor targets, not threats from unexpected angles. Kennedy's third priority target was an enemy sniper who had been engaging Alpha Company with effective precision fire. His hide was nearly invisible from below, but clearly visible from her elevated flanking position. Eliminating him would remove the most immediate threat to her fellow soldiers. Range calculations confirmed distances between 1,150 and 1,400 meters to various targets. Wind conditions were favorable but variable, requiring continuous monitoring and adjustment for each shot. Atmospheric pressure and temperature were optimal. For long-range precision work, she began her engagement sequence with the systematic precision of someone whose training had prepared her for exactly these conditions. Her breathing controlled, heart rate managed through techniques that maintained steady aim despite combat stress. The rifle became an extension of her will, mechanical precision guided by mathematical calculations and years of experience. First shot would determine everything. Success would begin dismantling enemy coordination and provide Alpha Company with tactical advantages they desperately needed. Failure would reveal her position to an enemy force that could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on her isolated location. Kennedy settled the crosshairs on her primary target, the enemy commander whose elimination would create the maximum disruption to Taliban defensive coordination. Distance: 1,247 meters. Wind: variable 6 to 8 knots from the northwest. Target movement: minimal, predictable. Her finger took up slack on the trigger as Alpha Company continued their desperate engagement below. Everything depended on the next few seconds. Kennedy's first shot broke the silence of Ridge 47 with surgical precision. The .308 round traveled 1,247 meters through shifting mountain air, arriving at its target with mathematical inevitability. The enemy commander on Miller's Point simply ceased to exist, his radio falling silent mid-transmission as Taliban coordination collapsed into confused shouting. Alpha Company felt the change immediately. The disciplined, coordinated fire that had been systematically suppressing their positions became erratic, unfocused. Enemy machine gunners were firing at shadows while their leaders tried to re-establish command and control that no longer existed. "What the hell just happened up there?" Staff Sergeant Coleman transmitted, his voice carrying cautious hope. "Their fire discipline just went to pieces." Kennedy was already tracking her second target, a machine gun team whose position had been decimating Alpha Company's left flank. The gunner was repositioning his weapon to engage new targets when Kennedy's crosshairs found him through 1,380 meters of clear mountain air. Her trigger pull was mechanical perfection, sending another .308 round across an impossible distance. With lethal accuracy, the heavy machine gun that had been Alpha Company's primary concern fell silent as its operator collapsed behind the weapon. His assistant gunner looked around frantically, trying to understand threats that were coming from directions they had never considered possible. Hayes watched through his binoculars as enemy positions that had seemed impregnable minutes earlier began showing signs of confusion and panic. Fighters were abandoning carefully prepared positions to seek cover from threats they couldn't locate or understand. "Kennedy, I don't know what you're doing up there, but keep doing it," Hayes transmitted. "Enemy effectiveness has dropped 70% in the last 2 minutes." Kennedy's third shot eliminated the sniper who had been engaging Alpha Company with precision fire from a concealed hide. The enemy marksman had been tracking targets through his scope when Kennedy's bullet found him at 1,156 meters, removing the most immediate threat to her fellow soldiers below. But her fourth shot was the one that changed everything. Through her rifle scope, Kennedy identified a target that nobody else had noticed: an enemy forward observer who was directing mortar fire from positions further up the mountain. The Taliban had been preparing indirect fire missions that would have devastated Alpha Company's exposed positions in the valley below. The forward observer was concealed in a rock formation that provided excellent protection from ground level observation but was completely visible from Kennedy's flanking angle. He was speaking into a radio handset, coordinates flowing in rapid Pashto as he prepared to call for fire on Alpha Company's positions. Range 1,423 meters. Wind gusting 8 to 12 knots from variable directions. Target partially concealed, moving sporadically. Shot difficulty extreme by any standard. Kennedy made calculations that accounted for bullet drop, wind drift, atmospheric pressure, and target movement patterns. The mathematics were complex, requiring instantaneous processing of multiple variables that most shooters would consider impossible under combat conditions. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm of someone entering a meditative state. Each heartbeat synchronized with ballistic calculations that had become automatic through years of training that went far beyond standard military instruction. The rifle settled into the perfect natural point of aim as wind conditions briefly stabilized. The shot was perfection incarnate. The bullet traveled nearly 1.5 miles through shifting mountain air, correcting for gravitational drop and wind drift with precision that defied conventional understanding of rifle capabilities. The enemy forward observer fell backward from his concealed position, his radio transmissions ending mid-sentence. Alpha Company's radio exploded with activity as soldiers witnessed marksmanship that transcended their understanding of what was possible. The enemy positions on Miller's Point had lost their coordination, their leadership, and their most effective weapons systems within minutes of Kennedy reaching her shooting position. "Holy Christ," Private Morrison whispered, watching enemy fighters abandoning positions they had held with fanatical determination moments before. "She's shooting them from positions they can't even see. How is that possible?" Corporal Thompson was equally amazed, tracking Kennedy's shots through his spotting scope. 4 shots, 4 kills, ranges that most snipers wouldn't attempt with optimal conditions. This isn't marksmanship, this is something else entirely. Hayes understood that he was witnessing capabilities that belonged in classified military units, not regular infantry companies. Kennedy had single-handedly neutralized an enemy force that had been prepared to inflict massive casualties on his soldiers. "Kennedy, whatever training you received, it wasn't in any manual I've seen," Hayes transmitted. "Your shooting is changing the entire tactical picture." Kennedy's response was characteristically understated. "Sir, proper fundamentals applied consistently produce predictable results regardless of range or conditions. But the enemy wasn't finished. Taliban fighters were adapting to threats they couldn't locate, repositioning personnel and weapons to counter attacks from unexpected directions." Kennedy could see reinforcements moving along ridgelines that were invisible to Alpha Company, bringing additional firepower to bear on the deteriorating tactical situation. Her 5th shot eliminated an enemy machine gunner who was repositioning to engage Alpha Company from a new angle. The range was 1,344 meters through mountain air that was beginning to show thermal disturbances from rising sun angles. Kennedy adjusted for atmospheric conditions that were changing by the minute, maintaining accuracy that defied meteorological challenges. The 6th shot removed an enemy sniper who had been attempting to locate Kennedy's position through counter-sniper techniques. He had been methodically searching Ridge 47 through his own rifle scope when Kennedy's bullet found him at 1,267 meters, eliminating the threat before he could identify her location. Alpha Company was beginning to advance up the slope toward Miller's Point, using the tactical advantage that Kennedy's shots had created. Enemy resistance was fragmenting as leadership and coordination continued, deteriorating under precision fire from directions they couldn't predict or counter. Alpha elements, advanced by fire and movement, Hayes ordered, finally able to execute the assault that had seemed impossible 30 minutes earlier. Kennedy has neutralized their primary defensive positions. We have a window of opportunity. But Kennedy could see what Alpha Company couldn't. Additional enemy forces moving to reinforce Miller's Point from positions throughout the mountain system. The tactical advantage she had created was temporary, dependent on maintaining pressure. That prevented enemy reorganization. Her seventh shot was the longest, yet 1,547 meters to an enemy commander, who was attempting to rally scattered fighters through voice commands and hand signals. The bullet's flight time was nearly 3 seconds, requiring Kennedy to predict target movement and wind changes across an impossible distance. The shot connected with mechanical precision, removing the last vestige of organized enemy resistance. On Miller's Point, Taliban fighters were abandoning positions, retreating deeper into the mountain system, rather than face threats they couldn't understand or counter. Alpha Company reached the summit of Miller's Point to find abandoned positions, discarded weapons, and evidence of a defensive network that had been systematically dismantled by precision fire from angles that conventional tactics had never considered. Kennedy had rewritten the fundamental mathematics of mountain warfare, proving that tactical innovation could overcome geographical disadvantages when applied with sufficient skill and audacity. 7 shots had accomplished what frontal assault could never have achieved. Alpha Company secured Miller's Point without firing another shot. The enemy positions that had seemed impregnable an hour earlier now stood empty, abandoned weapons still warm from recent use. Taliban fighters had retreated deeper into the mountain system rather than face threats they couldn't comprehend or counter. Kennedy's 7 shots had accomplished what conventional assault doctrine said was impossible. Captain Hayes stood among the abandoned machine gun nests, studying fields of fire that would have devastated his company during a frontal assault. Each position had been expertly sited, mutually supporting, designed by someone with formal military engineering knowledge. The fact that these positions now stood empty was testament to tactical innovation that transcended conventional battlefield mathematics. Sir, we're finding evidence of at least 30 enemy fighters who occupied these positions, reported Corporal Thompson, examining discarded equipment and ammunition. Radio gear, night vision devices, sophisticated communication equipment. This wasn't a militia. This was a professional military force. Hayes nodded grimly. Intelligence had underestimated both enemy numbers and capabilities, setting Alpha Company up for what should have been catastrophic casualties. Instead, they had achieved complete tactical victory with 0 friendly losses, thanks to one specialist's willingness to challenge conventional thinking. Kennedy's descent from Ridge 47 took 40 minutes of careful movement through terrain that remained potentially dangerous despite their tactical success. Enemy forces had retreated but not disappeared, and isolated fighters might still pose threats to unwary soldiers. Her approach to Alpha Company's position was methodical, professional, maintaining security protocols even in victory. Staff Sergeant Coleman was the first to greet her return, his expression transformed from earlier skepticism to something approaching awe. Kennedy, I owe you an apology. What you just accomplished, I've never seen anything like it in 15 years of combat operations. Sergeant, conventional tactics work until they don't, Kennedy replied, checking her rifle's condition with automatic precision. Sometimes battlefield geometry requires unconventional solutions. Private Morrison approached with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of someone who had witnessed legend in the making. Specialist Kennedy, those shots you made. The longest one had to be over 1,500 meters in combat conditions. How is that even possible? Kennedy considered her response carefully. Military operational security required discretion about capabilities and training that might reveal classified information. Marksmanship is physics, Morrison. Consistent application of ballistic principles, produces consistent results regardless of range or environmental factors. But Hayes had questions that went beyond technical curiosity. Kennedy's performance suggested training and experience that far exceeded anything in her official military records. Her tactical analysis had been sophisticated, her shooting capabilities extraordinary, and her fieldcraft skills professional grade. "Kennedy, where exactly did you learn to shoot like that?" Hayes asked directly. "Your service record shows standard infantry training, but what I just witnessed was special operations level capability." Kennedy's pause before responding suggested careful consideration of operational security requirements. "Sir, some training occurs outside normal military channels. Specialized instruction for personnel with demonstrated aptitude." "Specialized instruction from whom?" Coleman pressed, his NCO instincts detecting evasion in her answer. "That information is classified, Sergeant." The radio interrupted further questioning with communications from higher command. "Alpha 6, this is base. Request immediate status. Report on Miller's Point assault. We're showing successful objective seizure with 0 friendly casualties. Confirm accuracy of reports." Hayes keyed his microphone with satisfaction. "Base, this is Alpha 6. Miller's Point is secure. 0 friendly casualties. Enemy force neutralized through precision fires from supporting positions. Mission complete." Alpha 6. Explain precision fires from supporting positions. "We show no artillery or air support allocated to your operation." Hayes looked at Kennedy, who nodded permission to explain. "Base, precision rifle fire from advance designated. Marksman, single operator, 7 shots. Complete neutralization of enemy defensive network." The radio silence that followed suggested higher command was processing information that challenged their understanding of what individual soldiers could accomplish under combat conditions. When base finally responded, their tone carried professional curiosity mixed with skepticism. Alpha 6 requested a detailed after-action report, including weapon systems, ranges, and tactical procedures employed. This engagement will require analysis at division level. As Alpha Company prepared for extraction from Miller's Point, the story of Kennedy's shooting was already taking root in military oral tradition. 7 shots across impossible distances, eliminating an entire enemy defensive network, changing the fundamental mathematics of mountain warfare through individual excellence. Corporal Thompson found Kennedy cleaning her rifle with methodical precision, treating the weapon with respect born of professional understanding. "Kennedy, can I ask you something? That shooting you did today, ... It wasn't lucky, was it? You knew you could make those shots." Kennedy looked up from her rifle maintenance, meeting Thompson's gaze directly. "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, Corporal. Today provided the opportunity. Preparation took considerably longer." "How much longer?" Morrison asked, joining the conversation with genuine curiosity. "Years," Kennedy replied simply, offering no additional details about training that remained classified above their clearance levels. The helicopter extraction arrived as the sun reached its zenith, painting the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and bronze. Alpha Company loaded equipment and personnel with the efficient teamwork of soldiers who had accomplished their mission against overwhelming odds. As the aircraft lifted off from Miller's Point, Hayes studied the terrain that had nearly cost him half his company. Ridge 47 stood innocent and unremarkable in the distance, showing no signs of the tactical revolution that had occurred from its summit. Geography that everyone had dismissed as irrelevant had become the key to victory. Kennedy sat quietly during the flight back to base, her rifle secured and her equipment properly stowed. She showed no signs of triumphalism or self-congratulation, maintaining the professional demeanor of someone for whom extraordinary performance was simply expected rather than exceptional. The after-action reports would become required reading. At military academies, case studies in tactical innovation and individual initiative. Kennedy's shooting would be analyzed by ballistics experts, studied by sniper instructors, and incorporated into advanced marksmanship curricula. But for Alpha Company, the lesson was simpler and more profound. They had learned that assumptions about capability based on appearance or position could be dangerously wrong. That tactical innovation often came from unexpected sources. That sometimes the impossible shot came from the ridge that everyone ignored. Years later, when Alpha Company veterans gathered to share war stories, they would always return to that day on Miller's Point, the day when conventional wisdom was rewritten by 7 shots from an unexpected angle, proving that individual excellence could overcome geographical disadvantages and change the outcome of engagements that doctrine said were unwinnable. Kennedy's name would be remembered, not just for her marksmanship, but for her willingness to see tactical opportunities that others missed, for proving that sometimes the best solutions came from positions that common sense said were impossible, shots that came from ridges that everyone ignored. The enemy had held the high ground, but Kennedy had found higher ground that no one else had bothered to consider. In warfare, as in life, perspective determined possibility, and the most effective solutions often came from angles that conventional thinking never explored. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.